Have you ever stopped and asked yourself that question? What is my purpose? Why am I here? What direction is my life actually supposed to take? Because here's something most people never say out loud. Even when you have a job, even when you have goals, even when your calendar is full and your life looks fine from the outside, that question can still be there. Sometimes quiet, sometimes buried, but it surfaces. It always does. It shows up when a chapter of your life closes, when you move to a new city, when something falls apart, or when something you worked hard for finally happens, and somehow it still doesn't feel like enough. It shows up when you watch someone else moving forward with clarity, while you feel like you're going through the motions, checking boxes, completing tasks, but not actually living. And here's what makes it even more disorienting. We live in a world with more opportunities than ever before, more options, more paths, more voices telling you what to do and who to be. You can study almost anything, work from home or from an office, create content, build a business, join a company, move across the world. The possibilities seem endless, and yet, that abundance doesn't always bring clarity. Sometimes it brings the opposite, paralysis. Because you're not just choosing a job, you're choosing a life. And choosing a life carries real weight. There's a quiet pressure that many people carry without ever naming it. Society asks us to decide too soon. At 15, 16, 17, we're expected to know who we're going to become. As if adult life is something you can fully understand from the outside, as if you can choose with precision before you've actually lived. Most young people have no real picture of what adult life feels like. They don't know what it means to wake up tired day after day, to hold a responsibility for years, to feel the days blurring together, to watch the clock and sense that life is moving past them in shifts and schedules. And yet we ask them, what are you going to study? What are you going to be? What do you want to do with your life? As if the answer were obvious. So many people grow up choosing blind, choosing out of fear, choosing by comparison, choosing based on what others expected of them. And perhaps the most uncomfortable truth of all is this. When you grow up, you realize that many adults don't know either. There are people who have spent 10, 15, 20 years on a path and still feel like something doesn't fit. They look stable from the outside, but inside, there's a quiet emptiness they can't quite explain. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. The exhaustion of living without meaning. And that's exactly where a word comes in. A word that's everywhere these days, but whose real depth most people never fully reach. Ikigai, an idea that many people have heard of, but when truly understood, it can change the way you see your entire life. With so many directions the world offers, so many careers, so many possibilities, it becomes genuinely difficult to know what we want to do with our time here. Society demands decisions at an age when we barely know ourselves. And the truth is, it's not that people don't want to live with meaning. It's that most of the time, they make choices without knowing what it actually feels like to live inside those choices long term. We choose careers without understanding what a typical day in that field really looks like. We choose paths out of pressure, comparison, or fear. We choose what sounds impressive, what seems stable, what others expect, and years later, when we're already inside that life, we discover that something doesn't fit. Many people end up in jobs they don't enjoy, not because those jobs are inherently bad, but because they don't connect to who that person actually is. When that goes on for too long, something strange starts to happen. Life becomes something you endure, not something you inhabit. You work, waiting for the weekend. You start the week thinking about when it will end. And without realizing it, Your days become organized around surviving. This doesn't always reveal itself immediately. Sometimes it gets normalized. Sometimes it's called responsibility. Sometimes it's called growing up. But living this way has a cost. Doing something that doesn't represent you gradually affects how you feel about yourself and how you show up in the world, especially when you see other people genuinely enjoying what they do and doing it well. That confronts you because it shows you that this isn't just about talent or effort. It's about alignment. And when that alignment doesn't exist, deeper problems begin to surface. People become deeply unhappy in their work. That unhappiness can lead to serious mental health struggles, including depression. Some even come to feel they've failed at life, not because they haven't accomplished anything, but because nothing they've done feels like it belongs to them. And here's something essential. This doesn't happen because there weren't enough options. It happens because most people were never taught to ask what truly fits their nature. So before we talk about purpose, before we talk about Ikigai, we need to acknowledge this starting point, the disconnection between what we do and who we are. That's where it makes sense to begin looking for another way to live. Facing this sense of disconnection, the Japanese developed a philosophy called Ikigai. Ikigai can be translated as reason for being, not as some grand epic mission, but as the thing that makes waking up each morning feel worthwhile. The thing you can pour your attention, your energy, and your time into. Something that, when you're doing it, doesn't feel entirely like a burden. Ikigai doesn't promise a life without difficulty. It doesn't promise constant happiness or instant success. What it offers is something simpler, and at the same time, much more profound. Alignment between what you do and who you are. When a person finds something they can genuinely invest in, to the point where everything else temporarily fades, they enter what psychologists call a state of flow. In that state, attention becomes total, effort feels different, time moves at a different rhythm, not because there's no work, but because there's coherence. Ikigai helps identify the elements that make this state not just occasional, but sustainable over time. It's not about chasing a single enjoyable moment. It's about building a way of living that doesn't constantly work against your own nature. That's why Ikigai isn't just an inspiring idea. It's a way of examining the relationship between what you do and the world you live in. A way of asking with greater precision, does what I'm doing make sense for me and for what surrounds me? At this point, there's something important to acknowledge. Even though many people feel trapped, the truth is that almost always, some degree of agency exists. You can't always change everything at once. You can't always walk away, relocate, or start over. But you're almost never completely stuck either. When life doesn't fit, two paths tend to appear. The first is finding a different relationship with what you're already doing. Sometimes shifting your mindset around a task can make it more bearable, changing how you organize your time, how you approach your responsibilities, how you frame the work itself. The second path is deeper, honestly re-examining your own nature and the nature of your environment, asking whether that place, that pace, that kind of work actually makes sense for who you are. Often, when you look clearly, you discover the problem isn't a lack of ability, it's a lack of fit, which is why the change that's usually needed is both internal and external, shifting the mindset from which you do things, and when possible, shifting the circumstances in which you do them. When both align, something particular happens. The effort doesn't disappear, but it stops feeling like a constant fight. And that's where flow becomes possible. When you do the right thing with the right mindset, your energy stops working against itself. That's where Ikigai becomes practical, not as an abstract idea, but as a tool for identifying what is actually right for you, so that getting up in the morning isn't just an obligation, but a natural continuation of who you are. Now, Ikigai isn't vague or abstract. It has a clear structure. Ikigai is made up of 4 dimensions that interact with each other. They're not steps, they're not levels, they're aspects that need to coexist. First, doing something you're genuinely good at. Second, doing something you love to do. Third, doing something the world actually needs. Fourth, doing something you can be compensated for. These 4 dimensions rarely appear together. In fact, most people only have 1 or 2 at any given time. And that's exactly why so many feel like something is missing, because when even one of these dimensions is absent, the whole experience becomes unbalanced. You can be excellent at something and still feel empty. You can love something and find no place for it in the world. You can do something useful without feeling connected to it. Or you can earn money doing something that has nothing to do with who you really are. Ikigai isn't about choosing just one of these dimensions. It's about observing how they relate, how they intersect, how they complement each other, and how, when they align, they start to give everyday life a sense of coherence. Understanding these 4 dimensions isn't a theoretical exercise. It's a way of seeing yourself more clearly and beginning to distinguish what's already present in your life and what's missing. The first dimension of Ikigai is doing something you're genuinely good at. Every person carries a distinct set of abilities. Some develop over time, others have always been there. Part of who we are comes from upbringing, environment, the opportunities we had. But another part is innate. Real differences exist between people, in how they think, in their sensitivity, in coordination, in physical capacity, in empathy, in analytical ability, in creativity. And yet many people spend their lives focusing almost entirely on fixing what they're bad at. They try to correct themselves, reshape themselves, force themselves to fit. Meanwhile, they dismiss or minimize the things they naturally do well. Perhaps the real question isn't where you fail, but where you flow. Because what sense does it make to invest all your energy into becoming barely mediocre at something, when you could develop and eventually master something you have a genuine gift for? When a person works from their real strengths, not only do they benefit, the world does too. The second dimension of Ikigai is doing something you love to do. This sounds obvious, but in practice, it's far more complex than it appears. Skill level can be measured. What you love cannot. Loving something doesn't mean enjoying every single second of it. It doesn't mean every part of the process feels good. Maybe you love writing, but struggle to share what you create. Maybe you enjoy teaching, but not all the logistics that come with it. Here's something worth noticing. Often, we don't hate the activity itself. We hate certain parts of the process, and that's where mindset matters. Sometimes changing how you work, your environment, your rhythm, or even the sequence of tasks can make something necessary feel far more bearable. Other times, delegating is an option. But there's a clear signal worth listening to. If an activity becomes truly unbearable, if you find no way to develop any genuine engagement with it, it may simply not be the right path. Maybe that field doesn't truly interest you. Maybe your strengths don't fit there, and that mismatch keeps generating constant frustration. In those cases, persisting isn't perseverance, it's just wear. Beyond analyzing skills, it's worth listening to something more subtle: intuition. Sometimes your body knows before your mind does what drains you and what keeps you alive. These first 2 dimensions, what you're good at and what you love, are foundational. But on their own, they don't yet form an Ikigai. Which is why, before completing the picture, we need to look at how the world enters the equation. The third dimension is simple to say, but harder to truly accept. The world matters. Not everything we love, and not everything we're good at, is necessarily useful to others. That doesn't make it worthless, but it keeps it in the realm of personal passion. For something to become a reason for being, it needs to touch someone else's life, even in a small way. The world doesn't always need grand gestures. It needs solutions, presence, care, order, relief. Sometimes what the world needs isn't glamorous, isn't visible, isn't celebrated, and yet it's essential. When what we do genuinely benefits others, something in the experience shifts. We stop orbiting only around ourselves and begin to feel part of something larger. The fourth dimension is money. And here it's worth being clear, without idealizing it and without dismissing it. Money doesn't define the value of what you do, but it does define whether it's sustainable. Without a way to support yourself, purpose becomes fragile. It turns into something you can only pursue at the margins of your time, in stolen moments. That doesn't invalidate it, but it limits it. That's why Ikigai doesn't exclude money. It integrates it, not as an end, but as the energy that allows a meaningful pursuit to continue over time. When these four dimensions converge, what you're good at, what you love, what the world needs, and what can sustain you, a perfect life doesn't appear. Something more real does, a coherent life. And that coherence transforms the everyday experience. Effort still exists, but it stops feeling like a constant war with yourself. The Taoists called this Wu Wei, action without force. Not because there's no work, but because there's alignment. Because when you stop forcing yourself to be who you're not, energy naturally reorganizes itself. And there's one more thing worth remembering. Ikigai isn't fixed. It's not something you discover once and carry forever. It changes with you, with your age, your circumstances, what life asks of you at different stages. Sometimes it's clear, sometimes it gets lost, sometimes it transforms. That's not failure, that's the process. Maybe the purpose isn't to find a single definitive answer. Maybe it's to learn to listen to yourself better at each stage of the journey, not to have everything resolved, but to live with less friction, more honesty, more meaning.